This is today's agenda. Again, if you can just sign in via the Zoom chat so we have record of attendance for today. Joining us today, we have Maya, who's going to give us an update on CSAP. We have Charles from the Flood Hub, who will be giving us some information on updates from there. Ashley is going to give us some information on the rain data that the TBRPC has available through the CDBG MIP program. And then we have Mr. Eddy from FDEP, who will be giving us some updates on the mapping tool and any information that we need on state guidance. And we thank you all for coming. We'll give it a couple more minutes. We still have some people signing in. Go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody. This is the Regional Vulnerability Assessment Open Forum. It's the second one we've had in the last few months. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead. Kara, if you want to stop sharing your screen. And then Maya, if you want to take over.
Okay, you guys seeing it in presentation mode?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me here today. It's been a minute since I've been able to talk to the region about updated recommendations for sea level rise projections for the Tampa Bay region. My name is Maya Burke. I'm the Assistant Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and I convene a group called the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about that group and the recommendations that we have for your consideration as you conduct vulnerability assessments for your respective communities throughout the region. So the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel is an ad hoc group of folks with scientific expertise. They represent entities from both the local, regional, state, and federal sectors, folks from universities, and folks from the private sector, all who have expertise in sea level rise or climate science, or are practitioners with a science background as well. This group has been meeting since 2014. It was originally convened by the UF-IFAS Florida Sea Grant Extension, and is now convened by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. And really the objective of this group is to provide scientific support for local governments who are planning for a changing climate. And to date, our expertise and our recommendations have really dealt solely with sea level change, although we are still, as a group, have a variety of different expertise and are available to the region considering other climate hazards as well. The recommended projections of sea level rise that we put out are explicitly named in the Memorandum of Understanding for the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition. So these recommendations are hopefully salient to you all, and you are, as signatories to the Resiliency Coalition, committed to implementing the recommendations that come out of the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel. So our recommendation was previously was done in 2019. The 2019 update was 5 years after the 2014 update that we put out. And so it's obviously been more than 5 years at this point, and quite a bit has changed both in the world of climate science with a new IPCC report and sea level change projections coming out at the international level, as well as a new national climate assessment, both being issued in 2023. And there have also been quite a bit of changes at the state level in terms of statutory requirements for those conducting vulnerability assessments, and the creation of the Florida Flood Hub, which Chuck will talk a little bit about later. Just a whole lot of information for the group to synthesize and consider in terms of updating the recommendation for our Tampa Bay region. So we've been meeting over the past several months, starting in the late winter and throughout the spring, to make sure that we have consensus and understanding, and that we're vetting the best available science so that you don't have to, and so that you can use our recommendation as you're moving forward with these vulnerability assessments. The updated recommendation, all of the nuts and the bolts of the recommendation, we have agreed on in concept. We are merely working on finalizing the written report, which is expected to be out later this month in late June. But I'm happy to be able to present to you the key elements of that recommendation today. For this updated recommendation, we evaluated 3 different sea level rise projection scenarios, those from the IPCC AR6, those from the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment, and then those that were put forward by the Florida Flood Hub last year. So the key components of a recommendation, this is something that hasn't really changed. We continue to recommend that local governments in the Tampa Bay region from Pasco County southward use a regionally corrected sea level rise projections using the St. Petersburg tide gauge. So this is applicable for Pasco, Pinellas, Hillsborough, Manatee, and Sarasota counties. And for those counties in the north, we continue to recommend that you regionally correct your sea level rise projections using the Cedar Key tide gauge. As you can see, I have an image on the right of my slide that is showing how those different tide gauges fit into 1 degree cells, gridded cells. We could delve into the details about this if you want, but you could see there is some differences between the amount of data richness for different portions of the counties, different portions of the region. So for example, if you're tuning in from Sarasota County, there are no tide gauges within your immediate county boundary that you could use to regionally correct sea level rise projections. That's why we continue to recommend that Sarasota County use the St. Petersburg tide gauge. For Citrus County and Hernando County, Cedar Key is the closest and most appropriate tide gauge that's within your grid. And then you'll see that gridded cell in the central portion of the RPC boundary area really has quite a few tide gauges that you could regionally correct to. But we've reviewed the data from all of those different tide gauges, and really the data shows that the longest and most reliable period of record is coming from that St. Petersburg tide gauge. While there's other valuable information to be had from the Clearwater tide gauge or from some of the other tide gauges further up within Tampa Bay, they're not really showing demonstrably different sea level rise conditions, sea level trends, and they just don't have that same long, reliable period of record for data. And so that's why we continue to recommend that the region regionally correct using the St. Petersburg tide gauge. We also take a look at how measured sea level has changed over time. I think the last time I was giving these projections, we were at just shy of 8 inches, like 7.8 inches of sea level change since 1947, if we're looking specifically at that recommended tide gauge in St. Petersburg. To update that to 2025 levels, we're now looking at 9.6 inches of increase in sea level since we started to measure change back in 1947. So this is just evidence that's showing that sea level change is already occurring here within our region, and that rate of rise is accelerating in recent years. So that's why it's important to look at sea level change projections. And while there's a lot of different options out there, the core meat of the recommendation is essentially that we project future sea level scenarios in methods using methods that are consistent with the National Climate Assessment, specifically the 5th National Climate Assessment curves. And we recommend using one of 3 scenarios that is within that suite of curves. That means NOAA intermediate low, the intermediate curve, or the intermediate high curve. So if you want to look and see what this looks like in tabular form, it's shown here. It's displayed both relative to 2 different data, both mean sea level as well as NAVD88. These we have added NAVD88 tabular calculations here to the recommendation based on some of the changes to Florida statute that are requiring that your planning be relative to NAVD88 instead of relative to mean sea level. But essentially what you can see here is that the region is generally looking at about 2 to 5 feet of sea level change by the year 2100. And I think it's notable how close all 3 of these scenarios are through mid-century. And you don't really start to see separation between the different sea level curve scenarios from intermediate low, intermediate, and intermediate high until you get in those really far out years, 2070 and beyond. So if I were to boil this down and the rationale, the major rationale behind how we made this decision, again, 2 to 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Those projections, they're pretty tightly clustered at the beginning, the first couple of decades. They really diverge in the latter half of the century. The reasons that we've selected this range of curves is really to capture what the best available science shows is the most plausible scenario. So we're not trying to capture every scenario, but the most likely ones that you might want to consider. So if you're thinking about the intermediate low, we think of that as the plausible lower bound. There's an 82% chance that we'll see greater amounts of sea level rise by the year 2100. The intermediate curve, there's only about 5% chance that you'll see more sea level rise than what's included in that projection by the year 2100. And we think that the intermediate high curve represents the plausible upper bound, given what we know now about ice melt and different mechanisms for ice sheet instability. And so that really is a less than 1% chance that we would see more than the projected values associated with the intermediate high scenario by the year 2100. So that was really those exceedance probabilities were a core part of the rationale for why we selected the curves that we did. And we feel that those plausible curves, those plausible sea level change scenarios are really ones that are useful for you all as practitioners to pick the right curve that reflects the different circumstances that you're having to balance and trade off. So we don't just recommend one curve, we are recommending 3, and we're doing that so that your adaptation planning can take into account a risk tolerance approach. We understand that each community is different. We want you working off the same set of numbers, but we understand you're not working off the same costs, the same facility lifespans, the criticality to your community, and the spatial vulnerability and location of those different assets and projects. Essentially, what we're trying to do is give you a suite of plausible curves that you could deploy in different contexts as it makes sense to your local governments. For example, if you have a project, say it's a boardwalk, it's something that's a low cost that you only expect to last maybe 10 years or less. So it's not particularly a long-lasting structure. It's not a high cost kind of thing. It's not super critical to meet the health, safety, and welfare needs of your community. That's something that you might find is useful or appropriate to apply an intermediate low curve in order to calculate the amount of sea level change that you should plan for to protect that asset. Likewise, if you have something like a multi-million or billion-dollar wastewater treatment facility that's critical to protect the health, safety, and welfare of your community, something that you expect to last, 50 years or longer, maybe close to the end of this century. It's something that has to be located close to the water, so it's highly vulnerable. These are all things that sort of might help push you in the direction of understanding that this is a facility that has a low risk tolerance, and so you need to plan for a more protective scenario using something like the intermediate high curve. I have some frequently asked questions here, but I thought that that's maybe that let this seed the discussion, and maybe now would be a good time to open it up to the group. But that's really the crux of the recommendation that's coming out from the Climate Science Advisory Panel. Again, the report will be available officially for you all to use later this June.
Thank you, Maya. We do have a few minutes. We're ahead of schedule. So if anybody has any questions for Maya or would like her to try to answer one of these questions that she
I
has.
can run through my own questions if
Yeah.
you need me to.
But we'll open it up. Does anybody have any questions? I'm not hearing any.
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah, just a real quick question. When you were going through the slide in the beginning, obviously talking a lot about the tide gauges, could you maybe just do a brief overview of what the gauges and the grids are, please?
Sure. So something that's new with the Fifth National Climate Assessment was to produce sea level rise projection scenarios at these one by one gridded cells. And I have not seen Chuck's slides, but if he's talking about the Florida Flood Hub sea level rise projection scenarios, then he might talk a little bit more about this. But essentially, it's just another way of taking the sea level rise scenarios that the federal task force looked at and providing smoothed out projections of sea level rise along the entire coast, because we understand that there is this variability in tide gauge data throughout the country. And some areas are incredibly data rich and others are not so much. And so the challenge, or the reason that we do this, is because sea level change is largely a global phenomena, but it is a global phenomena that can be experienced differently based on different regional conditions. And so it's important to look at regional conditions to understand what external factors might be influencing sea level change in that region. So for example, in some portions of the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America region, you have lots of oil and gas and freshwater, groundwater extraction activities. And these can, lead to things that exacerbate the way that we experience sea level change. Similarly, in portions of the West Coast, for example, you might see how glaciation and uplift is making it seem as though there's less sea level change going on. So that's why it's sort of important to take these global patterns and then match them up with local conditions so that you can kind of see how that change might be experienced. Like I said, I don't really want to steal all of Chuck's thunder, but part of what the Florida Flood Hub was doing was looking at whether or not it makes sense to use some of these more nationally regionalized projection scenarios, or if it made more sense to look at something on a statewide basis for Florida. And so I'm going to let him talk a little bit about that, but it's basically just like another place, another point in space and time where you can connect these conditions to either a grid or to tide gauges within that grid. And so I think that so in some ways it introduces like more things for regular people to try and understand. And in other ways, I think you could think about it as an additional kind of line of evidence that gives you confidence that all of these tide gauges within this one by one grid cell are experiencing similar kinds of conditions. And so there's no reason to sort of like fight over picking the Clearwater tide gauge versus the Old Tampa Bay tide gauge versus the Hillsborough Bay tide gauge or Port Manatee. We can just use one and understand that really our region is primarily falling in this one major grid area. And what Pasco County is experiencing in the way of sea level change is very similar to what Manatee County is experiencing in the way of sea level change. I'm not sure if I did a good job answering that, but I tried.
Oh, that was wonderful and really interesting and helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Maya?
Kara, this is Jim Birch.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, how you doing? Long time no see. My one question is, it may sound rather simplistic, but we're from the Southwest Florida, down south a little bit. Is there a way of extrapolating the coastal, maybe the inundations, the tides from your area down to the Southwest Florida region? I mean, I know that you wouldn't be entirely accurate, but I'm trying to get a sense of the entire coast along the Gulf of America or Mexico, whichever you want to call it.
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, I would encourage or I discourage you from extrapolating information from one like tide gauge out into the future. But what Chuck will share with everyone is that really Florida is remarkably uniform in the way that we are experiencing sea level change. So while it would be valuable for us to have additional tide gauge information for a myriad of different reasons, really for the most part, the kinds of sea level change that we're experiencing in Florida are pretty close to the kinds of sea level change that you're experiencing based on the global average. So I would just say the reason that you want to pick a tide gauge and that we continue to recommend regionally correcting to a tide gauge is because it gives you a connection to a point on land. So it's helping you pick a datum, a vertical datum. And so I think the datum that you would get from St. Petersburg is relevant far down the coast in Southwest Florida. And then I would say that really for most of Florida, it's pretty darn close to the global rate of rise. And so if you see tools that are being put out there, I think in Florida, you should be able to use them confidently that there's not significant coastal differences, related to groundwater withdrawals or uplift or subsidence or any of these kinds of things that would allow you to apply them in your region.
Thanks, Mike.
Mhm.
Okay. Ashley put a related question in the chat. Ashley, do you want to ask that question now or wait for Eddy?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a question for Eddy or somebody at FDEP. Since the CSAP is recommending the 1 gauge, is that acceptable in lieu of the Resilient Florida statute requirement of interpolating between gauges?
So it's not like a blanket approval. Each grant would have to get a separate departmental approval just because we would deviate from statute. We have to have that in the file. If that's the rationale that you want to propose, like the reason we want to use one is because of CSAP's recommendation and their work and scientific expertise. I think we can consider that as justification. We also need to know what the other closest tide gauge is and whether that tide's level's higher or not than this one or the one that you're going to use. And then an appropriate rationale there too. So, I mean, I think it provides a basis to use one, but we still would need to review those on a one-off.
Okay. Understood. Thanks, Eddy.
Do we have any other questions for Maya? Okay, go ahead and Charles, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take over.
Okay, so PowerPoint appearing.
Yes.
Okay. Again, thank you for giving me this opportunity. It kind of arose out of a meeting that I listened in on, and there were a lot of questions about the Flood Hub, so it felt like time to provide some background. Hang on, here we go. So the Florida Flood Hub really is designed to support the Resilient Florida program. You're all familiar with what the Resilient Florida program does, and Eddy will be on in a minute. But the concept of the Flood Hub was to sort of provide this data on future vulnerability. And the vulnerability obviously factors into funding. And the Flood Hub was meant to kind of level that playing field so that folks would have at least one place they could go to get solid information. Again, the Flood Hub information is not prescriptive or proscriptive, so it's not thou shalt or thou shalt not. As the discussion just pointed out, it's, you can justify go in a different direction if needs be. The Flood Hub potted history here. Probably the key for today is, again, we are trying to bridge the gap among the scientists, policymakers, practitioners, and the public across the diverse audiences that comprise Florida. And to help us do that, we've brought on 4 scientific liaisons who's going to kind of work through the water management districts as a kind of a way to leverage, their regional view of the world. It boggled my mind to think about 67 liaisons, and so 4 right now, potentially 5 seem doable. So these folks should be online as well, and we'll probably be in touch in the future for sure. So we're going to go through the 3 work groups. Work groups are kind of the core of the way the Flood Hub operates. So it gets the best available experts and brings them together to go over these various issues. So the sea level change work group, again, work groups try to take the best available data when there are data there and work with those. And so the data for what the sea level change work group has done was from the 2022 federal report that came out. And the work group focuses on sea level rise as it affects all of Florida. Again, assessing the risk, which has got a magnitude of the impact and the likelihood of that impact, and document changes from 2000 out for 5 what are called scenarios, which is the way the climate world operates their modeling exercise from low to high. And Maya pointed out the intermediate, low, intermediate, high scenarios. And we looked at 4 time horizons, and there'll be more to come. That's all of the magnitude. Then in order to do the likelihood, you have to kind of incorporate changes in mean surface air temperature. And so we worked through the likelihoods for different air temperature changes. As was pointed out, one of the things the Flood Hub tried to do was to take the data that were in the federal report and focus them, tailor them to Florida. So in the federal report, as is true of many national efforts, Florida gets split, with the East Coast going with the Carolinas and so forth, and the Gulf Coast going, with the western states to the west. So this figure looks at the total predicted change in sea level in millimeters. That's the blue line near the top. Then it has the ocean change. That's a component of the total. The vertical land motion is the purple line at the bottom, and that's another component of the total. And then that yellow line is the global average, which is, again, as Maya points out, if you look at the blue line, the total for Florida, between those 2 vertical lines, the left one being Pensacola and the right one being Jacksonville, that change is pretty close to the global change. So the sort of regionalization and tailoring, they will affect your values, as it were. And so that's what the flood hub's trying to sort through. So the data pointed us to this kind of conclusion, intermediate, low, and intermediate, and a change in sea level out to these various time horizons from sort of 9 inches to 22 inches. So why choose those scenarios? And that goes back to trying to incorporate the most likely change in temperature, which at this point looks like a 3-degree increase by 2100, based on everything that the international folks have pulled together. And then you look at the exceedance probabilities, as Maya pointed out. So what's the likelihood that we'll go beyond the intermediate scenario given a 3 degree C change in temperature? And then what's the likelihood you'll go beyond the intermediate low? And so that's kind of the sweet spot. And so that's why we went back and kind of focus on those scenarios. When you look overall at what the Flood Hub has done and compare it to that 2022 report, the Flood Hub's projections are in the solid lines, and the estimates from the report are in the dashed or dotted lines. And in all cases, you can see that the Flood Hub's ones are just a bit lower. And again, that's because of this regionalization effect. So then, as Maya pointed out, this information needs to be combined with, what could be shorthanded as your tolerance for risk. And that will vary from project to project and timeline to timeline. The Flood Hub has worked with DEP. And so now on the DEP website, there are the Flood Hub's estimates folded into changes at all the tide gauges around Florida at the different time horizons for those 2 most likely scenarios. So that information is available for folks to use. The sea level change work group knows that there are things that need to happen beyond what they've done so far. They want to go back and take a good hard look at the exceedance probabilities and make sure that they hold across all the different kinds of emissions scenarios, as it were, pathways, and the different time horizons. They also want to look at the occurrence of high tide flooding and flooding due to severe weather, and then take a good, careful look at tide gauge data. So there's some reasons to spend a little more time looking at extrapolating the tide gauge data into the future. The federal report did do that. The work group felt that we might want to look at it a little more closely, and so they will be doing that. And then there are regional ocean processes that probably need to be considered for Florida, if there are changes to the Gulf Stream and other changes like that. The rainfall work group is not quite as far along, although they're getting pretty close. And their concept there is to look at changes in precipitation. So driven by the fact that, warmer air holds more water vapor, that 7% for each 1 degree C rise in air temperature is the kind of physics behind the whole thing. The international efforts have moved from looking at sort of strictly physical forcing in terms of changing how much heat is retained by the atmosphere of the Earth to trying to push it back to the sort of socioeconomic drivers that will govern how nations deal with emissions. The emissions are the things that lead to the increase in temperature. By changing the radiative forcing, it changes the amount of heat that's kept in the Earth's atmosphere. The concept behind the rainfall work group are delivering what are called change factors. So the idea is to have your models validate that they work by looking at matching them with observed data from the past, then have predictions of future and historical sort of rainfall patterns or rainfall amounts, and then comparing those. So the ratio of the future to the historical gives you a change factor, a multiplier, as it were. Those are meant to be applied to design storms. So there are existing design storms. You folks probably know that better than I do even. There are 242 stations around Florida where you can go and look at the depth duration curves. So how much water accumulates depending on how long the storm lasts and how extreme the storm is, with return intervals of 2 years to 1,000 years, going from less extreme to more extreme. And so the change factors get applied to these design storms. The work group looked at 1, 3, 7-day periods of rainfall. It looked at the extreme values from the model output for return periods of 5 to 500 years. And the numbers get a little shaky as you head out in the 100, 200, and 500 year range. Then look at the depth duration frequency or intensity duration frequency curves. And again, comparing the future and historical gives you a change factor. And so these are the change factors that get generated. To the left of that vertical red line are the change factors from the CMIP-5 exercise, which was the global exercise that preceded CMIP-6, the most recent one, which are the two sets of data to the right of that red line. And what the graphs show you are the medians, which are the points, and then the 17th and 83rd percentiles, which tries to capture the spread of what the models predict. So you can't really think of them as strict statistical uncertainties because the way the work is done, the outputs of the models are not totally independent of each other. But they do give you some idea of the spread that's there. So these were all the data that were available to the work group, with CMIP-6 coming in just about as everybody had finished working on CMIP-5. So some questions arose. Do you want to go with CMIP-5, CMIP-6, or some combination of the two? When it comes to the data sets, which differ in the way that the information from the models is downscaled to get it to the sort of station level in Florida or elsewhere. And then do we want to provide people with change factors for the variety of forcing that's been looked at, the shared socioeconomic pathways, as it were, that drive the emissions, which drives the warming? Is there a spatial differentiation in change factors across the state? And then is there any need to take the data that you end up with and cull those data to remove things that don't fit with this underlying physics, which is this Clausius-Clapeyron scaling, the 7% increase in water vapor for 1 degree C increase in temperature? So I'll spare you the sausage making. And basically the work group decided to move to CMIP-6. So again, the approaches that had been done in CMIP-5 weren't carried forward into CMIP-6. They decided to pick one of the two downscaling approaches because there was less confidence in the other one. So what's called the LOCA 2 approach is the one that's going forward. They decided to provide change factors for all of the different combinations of, all of the SSPs individually, combined with all of the durations and return times, and you'll see what that looks like. Looked pretty hard at spatial differentiation of change factors and couldn't really see a consistent pattern. So the pattern seemed to change with the duration or with the forcing. And so right now, going with pretty much statewide values. Did look at this scaling issue and decided that didn't really need to cull the medians that were generated because they're consistent with that scaling. Also then had a shift. So the work group had been generating estimates for 2040 and 2070, and now we need to come up with 2050 and 2080 to comply with the requirements. So they're working on that one. So this is kind of where we were before the 2050, 2080 issue. So these are the values for LOCA 2. There are 27 models that go into this kind of mix. Again, the change factors, that's the y-axis, and the dots are the medians, and then the 17th and 83rd percentiles. And if you look across all the different forcings from SSP 2 4.5, which is the least temperature change in the atmosphere to SSP 5, 8.5, which is the most. The medians for the change factors go from 1.03 to 1.16. So that's 3% to 16% more rainfall for a given storm. Rainfall Work Group also realizes that the statistical downscaling causes people some qualms. It can lead to biases in the output. And so they want to try to dynamically generate the estimates of change factors. And the way that we're going to do that is to join basically 3 different groups of modeling together to take the resolution of the global climate models, which are kind of these 1 degree by 1 degree, so 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer down to 10 by 10 to 25 by 10 to 25 kilometers, and try and scale that down to something that's more local and more useful in a lot of things that need to be done. So try to involve these local processes that you see listed, as well as retain the large scale drivers. So the global models, in a sense, they barely even see Florida, right? It's not resolved by the model very well. So the approach that's being used is to use a community Earth system model to take the resolution down to 25 kilometer atmospheric and 10 kilometer oceanic grids. And so in the figures here, the left one is what the output from CNIP 6 looks like for the surface current speeds. But you can see in the right one that the more high resolution modeling resolves things like the Gulf Stream going up the East Coast and so forth. And so that's going to be important. Then to take the output of that model and use that as the kind of boundary conditions input for a regional spectrum model and a regional ocean system model that are linked. And that brings the resolution down to about 10 kilometer grids. And so here the figure shows you that the observed precipitation in millimeters per day is on the left. The community model is in the center, and then this coupled model is on the right hand side. And so again, just basically can pick out the green areas and see that the coupling seems to help resolve where the rainfall actually occurred. And then the third one is to bring the whole thing down to about 2 to 4 kilometer grids. And that's going to come from the weather research and forecasting model. And so if you watch the animation, you see the rainfall on the left. You can watch the soil moisture change in the center and the temperature change as these storms pass through Florida. So that's what we're trying to do coming up, is to try and dynamically model the precipitation. So the concept though is basically the same. Check your models with a reference period so that everybody's model seems to be tuned. Do historical ensembles, so 5 by 10-year simulations. Then add warming of 2 degrees and 3 degrees and run some more simulations. Process the data, pull out the extreme values, and use those to generate those change factors. The third one I'll just touch on is what we're calling a comprehensive modeling work group. So the Flood Hub's initial key target is compound flooding, as it's called, which is this concept of you're having higher sea levels, so you get various increases in coastal inundation, as well as you're going to have a higher amounts of precipitation in any given storm. And where those two meet, you get compound or total flooding. And so we'll try to sort that out. Again, both the magnitude of that as well as the likelihood. And that's, I think the likelihood is where the intricacy starts to come in, because now you're looking at the joint probability of somewhat rare events. And that's the figure on the right, gives you an idea that it's not going to be a linear relationship. So as you get increasing surge and increasing rainfall, the chance of compound flooding increases, but not in a straight line fashion. The Flood Hub has also taken on some other tasks. So we're going to curate this inventory of models, H&H models, which was begun in South Florida and was expanded in conjunction with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Silver Jackets. And the Florida GIO put this together as a dashboard. And we're going to take this dashboard and add to it and enhance it. But this is a place where you can go in and see, what kind of modeling is in the various regions of Florida. And particularly then, that will help Resilient Florida, when they're funding things, focus people in on the gaps where we need more modeling. We want to link up with some of the predictive stuff that's going on. So the Ocean Circulation Lab at the College of Marine Science, USF, has this operating where you take observations of sea level, and then you have a model that's the moving dots there. And you can see it tracks the observations, and then you can look out ahead. The model will look out ahead and show you what's likely to come. So it's kind of an nowcast, real-time forecast, as it were. Working with Center for Ocean Mapping and Technology to try and improve bathymetry. So a lot of the coastal effort relies on good bathymetry, and we could use better bathymetry in some areas, and so we're working with them on getting some of that going. Again, shooting towards things like digital twinning, where you basically build a digital model of your area of concern. This graphic shows you on the left there the sort of areas that are under threat, and then there was some that in the kind of orange color, and then there was a scenario where they said, well, let's put in some protection, and then you can run that scenario and see how it changes the predicted flooding. And so what does this all kind of boil down to? Higher sea levels and more intense rainfall are going to increase the risk of flooding. The increased flooding obviously threatens lots of things. The magnitude and likelihood of the risk are needed for effective planning and response. And the statewide estimates tailored to Florida will help people safeguard lives and property, invest wisely, so not over-engineer or under-engineer things, and prepare for the future. And again, the Flood Hub is meant to help all communities have a basis for doing that. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Any questions?
Amy, I got one.
Okay.
Chuck, I don't know if I missed, or did you say that the change factors are available now?
They are not quite available now, in part because we're trying to generate the 2050, 2080 numbers. And yes, so, and there've been multiple changes in personnel, particularly at the federal level, which is where our partners were. The USGS helped us with the change factors.
Yeah.
Some other folks have moved on, so.
That's why I found this USGS link that I put in the chat that I was wondering, it mentions you all. And I was wondering if that was it, but kind of the links go nowhere. So, okay, I will wait for those. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, some of the basic data are there, but in order to, again, tailor stuff to Florida, it takes a little work, so.
Thanks, Ashley. Any other questions for Chuck? Okay, well, if you think of any as we go along, you can either put them in the chat, or we'll have a few minutes at the end for more questions and open discussion. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to. Oh, I think we were going to go, Ashley, if you had you wanted a couple minutes to go ahead and talk first before Eddy.
Yeah, I'll be really quick, Amy.
Okay.
Can you see my screen in presentation mode?
Not yet. Oh, there it
Yes.
is.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Ashley Mott. I'm the GIS manager at Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and I just wanted to quickly show you all some data that we developed that depicts future flooding from extreme rainfall. And this data comes from a project called Advancing Mitigation Assessment and Planning, and it's a collective of 6 Florida RPCs. East Central Florida is the lead on this project. They got $1.5 million from Florida Commerce. It's a CDBG MIT grant to provide a cohesive statewide approach to resilience planning. And there is a really big focus on extreme rainfall. So there's many outcomes to this project, but the one that I want to talk to you all about today is rainfall flood modeling and GIS data. And East Central Florida, they put together a technical advisory committee for the project to inform the modeling. I think there may be some overlap with the work group at Flood Hub. I'm not sure. I'll ask Chuck later to verify that. But essentially what they did was choose some change factors to apply to the Atlas 14 curves. And they did this for 100-year, 24-hour rain events for 2040 and 2070. And if anybody's interested in getting into the weeds on what that tax findings were, I can put my email in the chat once I'm done presenting and you can contact me. And then the TAC guidance then informed the GIS tooling, which was developed by Flynn Metrics, a consultant that East Central Florida hired. And the modeling combined 2 types of models, which was flow and ponding. And again, there's a lot of background information that I can share with anybody who's interested in using this product. And I'd be happy to get you that information offline. And I'm kind of just glossing over the fact, I'm just showing a few examples of what this data looks like. And each RPC was tasked with creating data with that tool, consultant tool for their respective geography. So we have it for our 6-county area. The data comes in depth grids and vector extents in GIS. And I've packaged these in SharePoint. There's the file geodatabases and ArcGIS Pro packages. So if you're a GIS practitioner, has Esri or QGIS or something like that, you can access this data and use it in your analysis. It can be used in Resilient Florida funded VAs. I know that East Central, although this was a DEO grant, they worked with FDEP to get approval for the data. And I know some of those VAs have already been approved. I don't want to speak for FDEP though, but yeah, this data has been used for VAs prior to July 2024, but as probably a lot of you on the call know, the guidance for the planning horizons changed after July 2024, and I know that East Central Florida and that consultant are working on updated tooling to address that for 100 and 500-year events. And I just wanted to quickly add before I wrap up some notes about data use. This data is not at all intended for site level design, engineering, or construction. It's city or county scale data. You could use it for a VA, screening for mitigation projects, or compare with other flood data in your analysis. Some examples of use so far. Pinellas County is using this in their VA. City of Largo is using it for some resilience planning. And TBRPC is using this as part of the Tampa Bay Coastal Master Plan. And I just wanted to share a few resources before I wrap up. I will add all the links that I had in my presentation in the chat here soon. And one of them is the story map I created for the project, just for our region, that talks about how to use the data and some more information about the project. So And also, if you're interested, you can join as a stakeholder. You can just contact me. And then I want to make a plug for a regional GIS group that TBRPC facilitates, which is for our member government GIS and planning staff. Our next meeting is August 14th, and we're going to have a Swift Mud presentation. We're going to talk about AI for GIS. And then also, I will drop this link in the chat of a YouTube video. We had a panel a couple of weeks ago where we had some FDEM, NOAA, and Hurricane Center folks talking about mapping resources for coastal resilience and emergency management. Amy, that's all I had. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay. So we will go ahead and turn it over to Eddy with FDEP.
All right. Sorry about that, Ashley. I jumped the gun. I didn't recall. I was right after.
Oh, that's okay.
So I'll be super quick. I mean, I know the meeting timeline ends at 2:30. I did get kind of bookended too, so I'll have to be a little late to that meeting. But I'll just do a high-level introduction of a couple things for the group to marinate on, I suppose. And then if you have another one of these or you'd like me to come back and do more in-depth, I'd certainly be happy to. But I wanted to introduce our statewide vulnerability assessments. So at the same time that all the local were doing vulnerability assessments, we were tasked with completing a statewide vulnerability assessment as well. And so we did that, and we built a web tool to show that the results of that study. And I'll put that link in the chat for you. And there's a lot of functionality in this application. This splash page is just a reminder that this is static data. It's not live feature service data that's being hosted somewhere else. It's just a snapshot in time. And we hope that this tool has like kind of that familiar look and feel. It's a GIS product. There's layers and filters and things that you can change. You can show different data sets like sea level rise from NOAA. You can add in, flood zones or wind zones in the building code. And that's all functionality for creating images, we call them, and those might help support project submittals or reports or anything like that. So I'll just kind of like also mention before I jump right in, slip report functionality is now within this tool as well. So it's kind of a two-in-one. So if you're familiar with the slip requirements or ever run a slip report on the old site, it brings you to this site now. But what this is the statewide data set. So we have millions of points, polygons, and lines that represent critical assets from multiple different data sources like DEM, EPA, kinds of sort of federal. And each one, so I'll just, I don't know what this one is. This is City Hall. So I can click on City Hall for Bel Air Beach. There's the source data, where the data from. I can see that this is from DEM. There's some of our information in here, like what House and Senate district number it's in, DOT district, all that kind of stuff. But the important stuff is now as we go through the information, we start to see those future scenarios. So like 2040 intermediate low, this was not affected in our study. But when you look at storm surge 100 year, it's high vulnerability. And then you have all those required scenarios from our statute. So if you have not completed a vulnerability assessment come July 1st of this year, when we open for grants, projects have to address risks that are identified in this tool. So Bel Air Beach City Hall would be eligible to receive grant funding to flood-proof the building, relocate the building, elevate the building, whatever mitigation strategy they want to take with that City Hall, because it is showing as vulnerable in the future scenario. So you can play with that and you can reach out to me with your questions. The other thing I wanted to mention was Our GIS standards have now been updated recently. And I'll admit that it probably would have been good if we had this from the beginning, because we probably have a lot of work that's out there that maybe it's impossible that you're going to meet these standards to a T. But we've created attribute tables, we've created data catalogs, we've said how to format your GIS data so that when that data comes in, we can incorporate it seamlessly into this tool. And so one thing that we might actually end up seeing this year for planning grants is, hey, I did my vulnerability assessment, but I didn't meet your GIS requirements. We want to meet the GIS requirements. So can you give us a grant to transform our data to meet the new requirements? And the answer is absolutely yes, we want that. And so we understand that this itself could be a project that's eligible for funding, just to take an existing VA and update it to meet the new standards. And maybe 2050 and the 2080 because you did the 2040 and 2070. So those are the types of things we might see coming around this year. And as that budget in the state gets finalized, we do expect either House or Senate did propose initially to provide funding for planning for Resilient Florida. So we expect that to come back around. Whew. Okay, I was trying to keep everybody's calendars in mind and fly through it. I can take a question or two. I'll leave it to the organizers to decide what we do here.
Thanks, Eddie. I see Claude has his hand raised.
Yeah, this is probably an ignorant question. Apologize, but on the example, Eddie, you're showing for Bel Air City Hall, you were showing different risk scenarios, and one of them, I think, was called coastal flooding or coastal surge. There was storm surge, and I didn't know what the difference was between those. Coastal tide flood versus storm.
Yeah, so we evaluated tidal flooding scenarios. That's just like your regular everyday tidal change.
Okay.
Storm surge, rainfall. We had a flood model that was created by a third party that helped inform. And then each asset sort of got a different, if it's a building, it was how deep is the flooding. If it was a road, how high is it above the center line? If it was a park, how much of the area is flooded in any given scenario. And that was sort of what laid out what the tolerance was for low, medium, high. And that was done statewide.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions for Eddie before he has to run?
Hey, Eddie. Maven Rogers. Thank you. You always do such a great job at the presentation. And thanks for plugging in there that there will be the state funds for the planning. My question for the planning grants, I know we had, you have where you do the vulnerability assessment and then you can apply for the adaptation planning. Is that the case this year? So in July, we've got the planning grant right now where we're going to do the vulnerability assessment. Can St. Pete also apply for the adaptation plan before our vulnerability assessment's done so we can kind of merge those efforts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We expect to see a lot of that this year as vulnerability assessments wrap up. We can also do, I'm just pulling up the statute for you to see kind of some of the references. Any resilience planning is really technically eligible. We also can do updates to existing asset inventories or vulnerability assessments. We can fund pre-construction activities for projects that you would submit for implementation down the road for communities eligible for reduced cost share. So we can help you get the design for projects to be later funded. If you're a small, fiscally constrained kind of community. And then one that I really want to see more of is we can do feasibility studies for nature-based solutions that reduce flooding. And so those would be fully funded feasibility studies to implement nature-based solutions to reduce flooding. And then if you have nature-based solutions that you're going to implement, we can pay for the cost of permitting as long as it's not our permit. But we can help you pay like federal permits or any other local permits that might be required. So there's a lot that's eligible. We've kind of focused on the vulnerability assessments in the first few years, but now that people kind of have that base going, we hope to get some variety and see in different kinds of projects.
Perfect. And are you guys opening up your office hours again for the summer?
Yeah, we'll have office hours while the portal's open, probably once a week. for about an hour. It seemed to tail off. We had a lot of really good engagement in the early parts of a lot of that, and then it tailed off. So we'll fire it back up.
Wonderful. And then, sorry, my last question for you. Are we eligible to, like, let's say, apply for an adaptation plan, and then also maybe a construction activity design at the same time? Can we apply for 2 planning projects at the same time, or is it one planning project per year?
Yeah, no, there's no limit on what you can apply for. And if you want to apply for multiple different projects and connect with us on, like, well, hey, here's our list of priority. If we're only able to get 1 or 2 in the funding, these would be the ones that we want at top. We've had people ask if they could do that, so we can try to help coordinate on that too.
Okay,
It's
wonderful.
really we just wait and see how many applications we get, and then we sort of like bucket different types of projects into tiers. And then we're just, how far can we get down tier 1? If we can get through tier 1, how far can we get down tier 2? It's really just like a budget exercise at that point.
Great. And then these grants are 100% funded, and the implementation is 50-50. Is that correct?
Yes. Unless the community is eligible for reduced cost share on the 50-50 part, they can qualify for less than 50 or no match.
Okay.
And that's like a population, a city less than 10,000, county less than 50,000, with per capita lower than the state average, or a per capita that's lower than 75% of state average.
Thank
and we've
you.
got a list. I can send you a list if you email me
Okay.
of what those communities are.
Thanks, Eddy.
All right, thank you so much, Eddy. I know you have to run, so we'll go ahead and cut you loose. If there's any other questions, you can add them in the chat, or Eddy put his email in the chat, so you can also follow up with him. So at this time, we will go ahead and open it up for any questions for any of the presenters or any topics that we want to have an open discussion about. So is anybody on the call that is entering their adaptation planning phase or have started it already in the process?
I know for St. Pete, we are going to start our vulnerability assessment. We awarded Maya's on here. We awarded the Tampa Bay Estuary program and the Water Institute, and we do look forward to applying for the adaptation plan in July.
Good, thank you, Maven. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Pete Altman. Sorry, my computer seems to want to take a picture from the backside, so I had to turn it around halfway through the meeting. But I know that the city of Newport Richey, which is my direct membership on the Planning Council, had completed its vulnerability study. We were one of the first to have an actual plan before those studies were done in that first year it came out. And that plan is for construction of an attenuation pond. But now that our vulnerability study is complete, I've learned today, thanks to listening, that we could apply for an adaptation plan. And considering the funds that are out there post-hurricane, trying to work with Pasco County to see if we can look on a larger scale city-county basis. So I see Megan is here, and I look forward to updating her and talking with Mr. Biddlecombe from Pasco and the folks there to try to do something that can hold ourselves up as a project as I look forward to next year's Palmetto Conference. And also just want to thank all of you all for your hard work, and I appreciate you all very much bringing this information out and being on top of things.
Thank you. The Lauren put a comment in Pinellas County, Pinellas Park, and several beach communities are entering the exposure and sensitivity analysis phase of their VA, and the adaptation plan will be next. Excellent. Lauren, do you have plans to go ahead and apply for that adaptation planning grant in this upcoming cycle?
We included the adaptation plan as part of our VA grant itself. So it's all together.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I missed it, but did Maya answer her frequently asked question about why not to use the low scenario or the high and extreme scenarios?
I did not answer that, but I'd be happy to. So the low scenario in the National Climate Assessment is still a linear extrapolation of the historic record. And so the reality is that when we measure sea level in multiple different ways. And based on data that's collected from satellite altimeters, what we are able to detect is that acceleration in the rate of rise. And so it's no longer appropriate to do that linear extrapolation. You need to think of it like a hockey stick, right? There's like a greater curve there. So that's why we don't recommend using the NOAA low scenario for planning purposes. And then a lot of times when we're talking to folks who are particularly concerned about adaptation planning and being climate ready, they want to use some of these like very high and extreme scenarios. They want to be really protective. And the reality is those are potential scenarios that could happen. But what would need to take place in order for those scenarios to happen would be some things that are not really fully well understood by the science. And it has to do with feedback loops and different kinds of mechanisms in ice sheet instability. So we may revise a recommendation in the future, but given what we know today and the state of the science, we really did constrain the curves that we're recommending to those scenarios that are the most likely to occur. So that information about exceedance probabilities that are tied to that 3-degree increase in air temperature was really important for us. And so the reason that we added the one additional curve beyond what is considered by Florida statute and by the Florida Flood Hub, we included the intermediate high. We did that because a 5% chance of seeing greater sea level than a scenario is perhaps not protective enough for some of these very large investments that some of you might make. So in certain scenarios, it might make sense to be more protective than the intermediate scenario. But you don't really gain very much in the way of certainty by going above and beyond the intermediate high scenario. In fact, you'd likely be wasting resources and over-engineering your structures if you're considering the NOAA high scenario, the 5th National Climate Assessment high scenario. Furthermore, in the 5th National Climate Assessment, there is no longer a NOAA extreme scenario. That is one of the things that changed from the technical report with the 5th National Climate Assessment. Basically, the technical report kind of showed that that wasn't feasible to see the amount of sea level rise in the time horizons that they were looking at in the extreme curve. Therefore, they excluded it in the most recent National Climate Assessment numbers. So again, we are trying to provide you with pragmatic and realistic scenarios for a variety of different needs that you might have. And we think that the scenarios that capture that the best, they don't go lower than intermediate low, and they don't really go higher than intermediate high.
Thank you, Maya. Any other questions, topics we want to discuss? Anything you'd like to see in the future presentations, something that's been missed in the last 2 forums?
This is probably a long-term question, but I know the CSAP is also going to explore some other flood types and Just maybe I would be interested in sort of that timeline, and I know that's probably further out.
I don't have any greater detail to report, but I appreciate your persistence on that and other indicators, and we will continue to work together to advance these things.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
My apologies if I had missed it, but was there a central resource or place to go to get more information about the funding and grant opportunities? I'm new to my position, and it's the first time I've been to one of these meetings, so I'm trying to kind of get my bearings with all that. And I don't know if I just missed that information or.
So for the Florida Resilient Grant Program,
Correct.
yeah, there's a website. We'll drop it in the link.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Anybody else? So anybody doing their adaptation planning or getting ready to, have you stumbled on any issues so far? Any best practices, lessons learned yet? Things we can look forward to talking about in the future as we transition the region into adaptation planning? No, do we have anybody from Pasco on the line? I see Sean. Sean, they did the adaptation plan at the same time, correct?
Yes, that's correct. We recently completed the Resilience and Sustainability Action Plan. So Pasco County took a little bit of a different approach in that nearly every government in Florida used Resilient Florida funding, but this was a CDBG grant. So there was a risk and vulnerability assessment, Resilience and Sustainability Action Plan, and then a Living Shorelines Plan as well. So it looks a little bit different, has broader components beyond flooding, but that's been completed as of last month. And I'll share the link to the Resilient Pasco project in here. There's a story map that was produced as part of the final product.
That was going to be my next question. Thank you very much. I have a question, and Eddie has already left the line, but maybe somebody can clarify for me. I believe he stated that if you're going in the next cycle for vulnerability assessments, you have to use their tool and make sure that you're incorporating all of the assets that are shown there. Did I hear that correctly? Did anybody catch that? He was given the Bel Air Beach City Hall example. So you have to make sure that we're including all of those assets in the VAs.
I could be wrong. I thought he was making the point that if you don't have your vulnerability assessments done by the time the next round opens, then you can use what's in the tool to apply for projects if those assets are listed in the tool. Not that you have to list those assets as well. I think you would just naturally list those assets because they're also critical. That's at least what I heard, was just that you have the opportunity to use that data.
Gotcha.
Okay. I think would make sense because they are getting a lot of that data from our vulnerability assessments. When we send in our tech reports, then they update their data set.
Okay, I might have misunderstood him then. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and let everybody go. We're about 9 minutes short of time. We had a lot of information today, a lot of good resources. if you have any questions or want to follow up, please feel free to reach out. We can contact our three presenters or put you in contact with them. So, and if there's anything we can do to assist you along the way with your VAs and adaptation plans, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.